In the dusty plains of rural Oklahoma, where economic hardship can drive decent people to desperate measures and family loyalty sometimes crumbles under financial pressure, there are still those who refuse to compromise their moral compass regardless of the consequences. In small communities where everyone knows everyone else's business, acts of courage and compassion can echo for generations. This is the story of Benjamin "Ben" Crawford, a weathered rancher who had built his life around solitude and hard work, and 18-year-old Elena Rodriguez, a brilliant young woman whose father's gambling debts had placed her in an unthinkable situation. When a desperate man's attempt to auction his own daughter to pay his creditors met with one stranger's unwavering sense of justice, neither could have predicted how completely their lives would change, or how their unlikely partnership would transform not just their own futures, but the very soul of their community. Sometimes the most profound acts of heroism happen not in grand gestures witnessed by thousands, but in quiet moments when someone simply refuses to let cruelty triumph over compassion, regardless of personal cost. Before we dive into this remarkable story of moral courage and unexpected redemption, let us know in the comments which city you're watching from. We love connecting with our global audience. Benjamin Crawford had been attending the monthly livestock auctions in Millerville, Oklahoma, for over 20 years, ever since he'd taken over his family's cattle ranch following his father's death from a sudden heart attack. At 45, Ben possessed the kind of weathered, sun-beaten appearance that spoke of decades spent working under the relentless prairie sun, combined with the quiet dignity of a man who had learned to find satisfaction in honest labor and the simple pleasures of a life lived according to unchanging principles. The auction barn on this particular Saturday morning in late September was filled with the usual mix of ranchers, farmers, and livestock dealers, conducting the kind of straightforward business that had sustained rural communities for generations. Cattle were changing hands based on weight and breeding quality, prices fluctuating according to market conditions and seasonal demand, and men were shaking hands on deals that would be honored without written contracts because a man's word still meant something in this corner of the world. Ben had successfully purchased 3 young bulls for his breeding program and was preparing to load them into his trailer when he noticed an unusual commotion near the main auction ring. A crowd had gathered around Carlos Rodriguez, a man Ben knew by sight but had never spoken to, a Mexican immigrant who worked various odd jobs around town and whose reputation for reliability had been steadily undermined over the past year by whispered rumors about gambling problems and mounting debts. Rodriguez stood in the center of the auction ring, his face flushed with shame and desperation, holding the arm of a young woman who appeared to be his daughter. The girl, who couldn't have been more than 18 or 19 years old, stood perfectly still with her head held high, but Ben could see the humiliation and terror in her dark eyes from across the barn. "Ladies and gentlemen," Rodriguez called out in heavily accented English, his voice cracking with emotion, "I need to settle my debts today, and I have only one thing left of value to offer." The crowd grew quiet, sensing that something unprecedented and deeply uncomfortable was about to unfold. Ben felt his stomach clench as he began to understand what he was witnessing. "My daughter Elena is 18 years old. She graduated high school with honors, and she can cook, clean, and work as hard as any woman in this county," Rodriguez continued, his words coming faster, as if speed might somehow make this transaction less horrific. "I'm asking for $5,000, and whoever pays that amount will have the right to marry her and take her home today." The silence that followed was deafening. Ben looked around the auction barn and saw expressions that ranged from shock to disgust to predatory interest on the faces of men he had known and respected for years. Several middle-aged ranchers were actually examining Elena as if she were livestock, discussing her appearance and potential value in voices that carried clearly across the suddenly quiet space. "She's pretty enough," one man said to his companion. "Good breeding age, looks healthy and strong." "5,000 seems steep," another voice called out. What guarantee do we have that she'll be obedient? Elena's face remained impassive, but Ben saw her hands trembling slightly at her sides. She was trying to maintain her dignity in a situation that was designed to strip away every shred of human worth and reduce her to a commodity to be purchased by the highest bidder. Ben had heard enough. Without fully considering the consequences of his actions, he stepped forward and climbed into the auction ring, his boots echoing loudly on the wooden platform. The crowd turned to look at him with curiosity and surprise, wondering what the notoriously private Benjamin Crawford could possibly have to contribute to this degrading spectacle. "Rodriguez," Ben said, his voice carrying clearly throughout the barn, "what you're doing here is not just morally wrong, it's illegal. You cannot sell another human being, even if that person is your daughter." Rodriguez's face flushed with a mixture of anger and embarrassment. "You don't understand my situation, Crawford. I owe money to people who will hurt my family if I don't pay. Elena understands this is the only way." "There is always another way," Ben replied firmly, "but selling your daughter like she's livestock is not one of them." "Then what do you suggest?" Rodriguez shot back. "You think any bank in this county will give a loan to a man like me? You think I haven't tried everything else?" Ben looked at Elena, noting the intelligence in her eyes and the way she held herself despite the humiliating circumstances. He made a decision that would change both their lives forever. "I'll pay your debts," Ben said quietly. "All of them. But Elena comes with me as my employee, not as property. She'll work on my ranch, I'll pay her a fair wage, and she'll be free to leave any time she chooses." The crowd erupted in surprised murmurs and heated discussions. This was not how anyone had expected this situation to resolve itself. Rodriguez looked stunned, uncertain whether to be grateful or suspicious of this unexpected offer. "Why would you do this?" Rodriguez asked. "You don't even know us." Ben glanced around the auction barn at the faces of men who had been prepared to participate in what amounted to human trafficking, then looked back at Elena, who was staring at him with a mixture of hope and disbelief. "Because it's the right thing to do," Ben said simply, "because no human being should be treated as property, regardless of circumstances. And because I have the means to help, which makes it my responsibility to act." Elena spoke for the first time since this ordeal had begun, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "Mr. Crawford, I accept your offer, and I give you my word that I will work harder than any employee you've ever had." Ode. As Ben wrote out a check to cover Rodriguez's gambling debts, an amount that represented a significant portion of his savings, but was still less than what he spent annually on ranch improvements, he realized that his quiet, solitary life was about to become considerably more complicated. But looking at the relief and gratitude in Elena's eyes, he also realized that some complications were worth embracing if they meant preserving human dignity and offering someone a chance at a better future. The crowd slowly dispersed, some people shaking their heads in disapproval at Ben's intervention, others nodding in respect for his moral courage. But Ben wasn't thinking about public opinion as he led Eleanor toward his truck. He was thinking about how to help a young woman rebuild her life after experiencing the ultimate betrayal by the person who should have protected her above all others. As they drove away from the auction barn toward Ben's ranch, Elena sat quietly in the passenger seat, processing the fact that her life had just taken an entirely unexpected turn. She had prepared herself for the worst possible outcome of her father's desperate scheme, but she had never imagined that a stranger would step forward to offer her not just rescue, but genuine opportunity and respect. "Mr. Crawford," she said finally, "I need you to know that I will never forget what you did for me today, and I promise you won't regret giving me this chance." Ben glanced at his unexpected passenger and felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of purpose that extended beyond the boundaries of his own property and personal comfort. Helping Elena was going to change his life in ways he couldn't yet imagine, but for the first time in a long time, change felt like something to embrace rather than resist. Building trust, The first week of Elena's presence at Ben's ranch was marked by careful politeness and mutual uncertainty, as both of them navigated the complexities of their unusual arrangement. Ben had converted the small apartment above his barn into comfortable living quarters for Elena, ensuring she had privacy and independence while remaining close enough to the main operations of the ranch to participate fully in the daily work that needed to be accomplished. Elena threw herself into her new responsibilities with the kind of determined intensity that spoke of someone trying to prove their worth after experiencing profound humiliation. She was up before dawn each morning, helping Ben feed the cattle, muck out stalls, repair fencing, and maintain equipment with an efficiency and attention to detail that impressed him despite his naturally reserved demeanor. Her willingness to tackle any task, no matter how physically demanding or unpleasant, combined with her obvious intelligence and quick learning ability, made Ben realize that her father's desperate auction had nearly cost the world a person of exceptional character and capability. But beneath Elena's professional competence, Ben could see the emotional toll that recent events had taken on her. She rarely spoke unless directly asked a question, ate her meals quickly and without apparent enjoyment, and maintained the kind of hypervigilant awareness that suggested someone who had learned not to trust her environment or the people in it. The confident, spirited young woman who had held her head high during that awful auction was still there, but she was buried beneath layers of caution and self-protection that would take time and patience to overcome. On the evening of her 7th day at the ranch, as they sat on Ben's front porch after completing the day's work, Eleanor finally broke the silence that had characterized most of their interactions. "Mr. Crawford," she said, setting down the glass of iced tea that had become their evening ritual, "can I ask you something personal?" "Of course," Ben replied, noting that this was the first time she had initiated a conversation beyond the practical necessities of ranch work. "Why did you really help me that day? I mean, I understand you said it was the right thing to do, but $5,000 is a lot of money to spend on a stranger, and taking responsibility for someone you don't know, that's a big risk." Ben considered her question carefully, recognizing that his answer would likely influence how she viewed both him and her place on the ranch. "Elena, I've lived alone on this property for most of my adult life. I've built a successful operation, accumulated more money than I need, and maintained my independence. But watching what was happening to you that day made me realize that independence, without purpose, is just another form of emptiness." Eleanor studied his face in the fading light, clearly processing his words. "So helping me was really about helping yourself?" "Partly," Ben admitted with the kind of honesty that had become natural to him over years of solitary self-reflection. "But mostly it was about recognizing that I had the power to prevent something terrible from happening to someone who didn't deserve it. Your father's debts weren't your responsibility, but they were about to destroy your life anyway. That seemed fundamentally unjust to me." "My father wasn't always like this," Eleanor said quietly, the first time she had voluntarily mentioned Carlos since arriving at the ranch. "When I was growing up, he worked hard, provided for our family, and taught me that education and honest work were the keys to building a better life. But when my mother died 3 years ago, something broke inside him. He started gambling as a way to escape the grief, and the gambling became an addiction that consumed everything else. "I'm sorry about your mother," Ben said, "and I'm sorry your father's grief led him to put you in an impossible situation." "The worst part is that I still love him," Elena continued, tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. "Even after what he tried to do to me, even knowing that he was willing to sell me to pay his debts, I can't stop caring about him. Does that make me weak or stupid?" "It makes you human," Ben replied gently. "Love doesn't disappear just because someone hurts us, especially when that person is family. But loving someone doesn't mean you have to accept being harmed by them." Elena was quiet for a moment, then looked directly at Ben with an expression of curious intensity. "What about you? Do you have family? Have you ever been married?" Ben felt the familiar tightness in his chest that always accompanied questions about his personal history. "I was married once, briefly when I was younger. My wife decided that ranch life wasn't what she wanted, and she left to pursue opportunities in the city. No children, no other family. It's just been me and the cattle for about 15 years now. Don't you get lonely?" "I thought I'd gotten used to solitude," Ben said. "But having you here, having someone to talk to and work alongside, has reminded me that there's a difference between being alone by choice and being isolated by habit." As the conversation continued into the evening, Ben began to see glimpses of the person Eleanor had been before recent traumatic events had forced her to build protective walls around her personality. She was intelligent, curious, and possessed a dry sense of humor that emerged when she felt safe enough to let her guard down. She asked thoughtful questions about ranch management, shared observations about the cattle and horses that demonstrated genuine interest and natural ability, and gradually began to relax in his presence. "Mr. Crawford," Elena said as they prepared to end their evening conversation, "I want you to know that I'm not just grateful for what you did for me. I'm grateful for how you've treated me since I've been here. You've given me work that makes me feel useful, living conditions that preserve my dignity, and conversations that remind me I'm still a person worth talking to." "Elena," Ben replied, "I want you to understand something important. You don't owe me gratitude for treating you with basic human respect. That should be the minimum expectation in any situation. What you do owe yourself is the chance to rebuild your life according to your own goals and values, not according to other people's expectations or limitations. What if I don't know what my goals are anymore? What if everything I thought I wanted was based on assumptions that no longer seem valid?" Ben smiled, recognizing something of his younger self in her uncertainty. "Then you have the luxury of time to figure it out. You have a job, a place to live, and the freedom to explore possibilities without pressure. That's more than many people have, and it's certainly more than you had a week ago." As Elena headed to her apartment and Ben settled into his evening routine, both of them realized that their unusual arrangement was evolving into something that resembled genuine friendship. The employer-employee relationship that had begun as a rescue operation was becoming a partnership based on mutual respect and shared purpose. But more than that, Elena's presence was forcing Ben to reconsider assumptions about his own life that he had held for years. The ranch that had been his refuge from human complications was becoming a place where those complications felt less threatening and more enriching. The solitude that had once felt like peace was beginning to feel like limitation. For Elena, working alongside Ben was providing the first stable, respectful treatment she had received in months. But it was also challenging her to think beyond mere survival and begin considering what kind of future she wanted to build for herself. The education that had seemed worthless when her father was trying to auction her off was beginning to feel like a valuable foundation for whatever came next. Both of them were discovering that sometimes the most profound changes in life come not from dramatic events, but from the gradual accumulation of days spent in the company of someone who sees and appreciates your best qualities while accepting your limitations and struggles with patience and understanding. The arrangement that had begun as an emergency intervention was slowly transforming into something that neither of them had been looking for but both of them desperately needed, a chance to build something meaningful together while maintaining their individual dignity and autonomy. Unexpected complications. 6 weeks after Elena's arrival at the ranch, their carefully established routine was disrupted by an unexpected visit that would test both the strength of their growing partnership and Ben's commitment to protecting Elena from the consequences of her father's past mistakes. The morning had begun like any other, with Elena and Ben working together to move cattle to a different pasture, when they noticed a black sedan making its way up the long gravel driveway, an unusual sight in an area where pickup trucks and farm equipment were the standard modes of transportation. The sedan stopped near the main house, and two men in expensive suits climbed out, their urban appearance and predatory demeanor immediately setting Ben on edge. He recognized the type, if not the specific individuals, debt collectors or worse, the kind of people who made their living from other people's desperation and financial vulnerability. "Elena," Ben said quietly, "go to the house and stay inside until these men leave." "Why? What's wrong?" Elena asked, though the fear in her voice suggested she already suspected the answer. "I think your father's creditors have found you," Ben replied, his jaw tightening as he prepared for what he assumed would be an unpleasant confrontation. The two men approached with the confident swagger of people accustomed to intimidating others. The taller of the two, a man with graying hair and cold eyes, spoke first. "You Benjamin Crawford?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "I am, and you are?" "Tony Marcelli," the man replied, not offering to shake hands. "This is my associate, Frank. We're here about the Rodriguez debt." "That debt was paid in full 6 weeks ago," Ben said firmly. "I have the documentation to prove it." Marcelli smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. "See, that's where things get complicated, Crawford. Carlos Rodriguez didn't just owe us money, he owed us money that he had borrowed against his daughter's future earnings, let's call it. When you interfered with our business arrangement, you cost us a significant investment." Ben felt his blood pressure rising as he began to understand the true scope of what Elena's father had gotten involved with. "Are you telling me that Carlos had already promised Elena to you before the auction?" Let's just say we had an understanding," Frank spoke for the first time, his voice carrying a subtle threat. "Rodriguez was supposed to deliver the girl to us after the auction, and we were going to collect our money plus interest through her work in one of our establishments. Your little rescue operation complicated that arrangement." "Get off my property," Ben said, his voice deadly quiet. Now, Crawford," Marcelli said, raising his hands in a gesture of false reasonableness. "We're not unreasonable people. We understand you thought you were doing a good deed, but business is business, and the girl represents a significant financial asset. We're prepared to offer you $10,000 for her, which is twice what Rodriguez owed us originally." Ben's hands clenched into fists, and he took a step closer to the two men. "Elena Rodriguez is not for sale at any price. She's a free person working for wages, and she's under my protection. If you have a problem with that, you can take it up with the sheriff." "The sheriff?" Marcelli laughed. "Crawford, you're not thinking clearly about your situation here. We know you live alone out here. We know you don't have any family to worry about, and we know that accidents happen on remote ranches all the time. It would be much simpler for everyone involved if you just handed over the girl and took our money." The threat was clear, and Ben realized that Elena was in far more danger than either of them had understood. Her father hadn't just been trying to pay gambling debts. He had apparently borrowed money from people involved in human trafficking, using Elena as collateral without her knowledge. "I'm going to give you exactly 1 minute to get in your car and leave my property," Ben said, his voice carrying the kind of controlled fury that suggested violence was not just possible but imminent. "After that, I'm going to call the sheriff and report that you threatened both me and my employee. And if anything happens to either of us, the sheriff will know exactly where to look for suspects." Marcelli's expression hardened, and for a moment the pretense of civilized negotiation disappeared entirely. "You're making a mistake, Crawford. We don't usually take no for an answer, and we have ways of changing people's minds." "Your minute is up," Ben replied, pulling his cell phone from his pocket. "Sheriff's Department, this is Ben Crawford out on Ranch Road 47. I need to report a threatening situation." "D." The two men exchanged glances, apparently deciding that the situation had escalated beyond their comfort level for this particular visit. Marcelli pulled out a business card and dropped it on the ground at Ben's feet. "Think about our offer, Crawford. We'll be in touch." As the black sedan disappeared down the driveway, Ben felt the full weight of what he had gotten himself and Elena into by intervening at the auction. These weren't just debt collectors. They were criminals involved in human trafficking. and Elena's father had apparently promised her to them as payment for money he couldn't repay through conventional means. Elena emerged from the house as soon as the sedan was out of sight, her face pale with fear and understanding. "They were from the people my father borrowed money from, weren't they?" "Yes," Ben said, deciding that honesty was essential given the seriousness of their situation. "And it's worse than we thought. Your father didn't just owe them money. He had apparently promised you to them as collateral." Elena's knees buckled, and she sat down heavily on the front steps of the house. "He sold me to human traffickers? My own father sold me to people who would have—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "Elena, listen to me," Ben said, sitting down beside her and speaking with urgent intensity. "None of this is your fault. Your father made choices that put you in danger, but you are not responsible for those choices, and I promise you that I will not let these people take you. But what if they come back? What if they hurt you because of me? Maybe I should just—" Eleanor's voice trailed off, but Ben could see she was considering sacrificing herself to protect him. "No," Ben said firmly. "We're not running and we're not giving in to threats, but we are going to be smart about this. I'm going to talk to Sheriff Morrison. We're going to document everything, and we're going to make sure these people understand that Elena Rodriguez is not available for any price." "Udiu, Ben," Elena said, using his first name for the first time since arriving at the ranch. "Why are you willing to put yourself at risk for me? You could just let them take me and go back to your quiet life." Ben looked at the young woman who had brought purpose and companionship back into his life and realized that his answer had changed since that day at the auction. It was no longer just about doing the right thing. It was about protecting someone he had come to care about deeply. "Because you're not just my employee anymore, Elena. You're my friend, and friends protect each other. And because I've discovered that a quiet life isn't worth much if it's built on abandoning people who need help." Uday. As they sat together on the porch, both of them processing the new reality of their situation, Ben and Elena realized that their arrangement had evolved into something neither of them had anticipated. What had begun as a business transaction disguised as rescue operation had become a genuine partnership based on mutual respect, shared work, and growing emotional connection. But it had also become something more dangerous than either of them had imagined. The simple act of preventing Eleanor's auction had put them both in the crosshairs of people who made their living from human misery and who would not be easily deterred from collecting what they considered their property. The quiet ranch that had been Ben's refuge from the world's complications was about to become the center of a conflict that would test everything he believed about justice, courage, and the responsibilities that came with having the power to help others. And Elena was about to discover that freedom came with its own set of risks and responsibilities that she had never been forced to consider. Their story was far from over, but the stakes had just become considerably higher than either of them had ever imagined possible. A community's choice. 3 months after Ben's confrontation with Marcelli and his associate, the situation had escalated in ways that neither he nor Elena could have predicted. The threats had not been idle ones. Ben's cattle had been poisoned, his equipment had been sabotaged, and Elena had been followed during her rare trips to town, making it clear that the criminal organization was prepared to wage a campaign of intimidation until they got what they wanted. But something unexpected had happened in response to these attacks. Instead of isolating Ben and Elena, the harassment had galvanized the community of Millerville in ways that surprised everyone involved. Sheriff Morrison, initially skeptical of Ben's claims about human trafficking, had become a believer after investigating Marcelli's organization and discovering connections to missing persons cases throughout Oklahoma and neighboring states. Local ranchers who had witnessed Elena's near auction had begun stopping by Ben's property regularly, ostensibly for business reasons, but actually to provide additional security through their presence. Most surprisingly, Elena herself had become something of a local hero after her story spread throughout the community. Her grace under pressure, her work ethic, and her refusal to be intimidated had earned the respect of people who initially viewed her as an outsider whose problems were bringing unwanted attention to their peaceful town. On this particular evening in December, Ben's ranch house was filled with an unusual gathering. Sheriff Morrison sat at the kitchen table with Ben and Eleanor, reviewing security footage that had captured two men attempting to break into the barn the previous night. Deputies had arrested the intruders, but everyone knew that Marcelli's organization would simply send more people until they achieved their objective or concluded that the cost was too high to justify continued effort. "We can't keep this up indefinitely," Morrison said, closing the file folder that contained evidence of the escalating harassment campaign. "These people have resources and patience, and they're not going to give up as long as they think Elena represents an asset they can eventually recover." "So what are you suggesting?" Ben asked, though his protective instincts were already providing an answer he didn't want to consider. "Witness protection," Morrison replied. "Elena testifies against Marcelli's organization. We relocate her somewhere far from here, and she gets a chance to start over with a new identity and federal protection." Eleanor, who had been quietly listening to this conversation, finally spoke up. "And what happens to Ben? What happens to this ranch and this community that has protected me? Do I just abandon everyone who has helped me and disappear?" "Elena," Ben said gently, "your safety is more important than anything else. If witness protection is the only way to guarantee that these people can't hurt you, then that's what we need to do." "No," Elena said firmly, her voice carrying a strength that had grown considerably over the past few months. "I'm not running away from this problem, and I'm not letting these criminals drive me away from the first place I felt truly safe and valued. There has to be another solution." Sheriff Morrison leaned back in his chair, studying Elena's determined expression. "What did you have in mind?" "I want to fight back," Elena said. "I want to help you build a case against these people that doesn't just protect me, but protects other women who might be in similar situations. I want to use my experience to help law enforcement understand how these trafficking operations work." "Elena, that's incredibly dangerous," Ben said. "These people have already demonstrated that they're willing to use violence to get what they want, and they'll continue using violence against other women until someone stops them," Eleanor replied. "Ben, you saved me from being sold into slavery. But how many other women are being sold right now while we sit here discussing my personal safety?" Before Ben could respond, the conversation was interrupted by the sound of multiple vehicles arriving at the ranch. Through the kitchen window, they could see the headlights of several pickup trucks and cars pulling into the driveway, far more traffic than the ranch normally saw in an entire week. "Are you expecting anyone?" Morrison asked, his hand moving instinctively toward his service weapon. "No," Ben replied, moving toward the window to get a better look at their unexpected visitors. What he saw outside surprised him more than any threat could have. Cars and trucks were parked throughout his yard, and dozens of people were climbing out, ranchers, farmers, business owners, and families from throughout the county. Some of them carried signs, others brought food and coffee, and all of them had the determined expressions of people who had come to take a stand. Elena joined Ben at the window, her eyes widening as she recognized faces from the auction barn, the grocery store, the feed supply company, and other businesses around Millerville. "What are they doing here?" Sheriff Morrison looked outside and began to laugh, the first genuinely relaxed sound any of them had made in weeks. "Unless I'm mistaken, it looks like they're here to make sure you don't have to fight this battle alone." The three of them walked outside to find that what had assembled in Ben's yard was nothing less than a community-wide demonstration of support. Tom Bradley, the rancher who had witnessed Elena's near auction, stepped forward as an unofficial spokesperson for the group. "Ben, Elena," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the cold December air, "we've been talking among ourselves about this situation, and we've reached some conclusions. First, what happened to Elena could happen to any of our daughters if we don't take a stand against these criminals. Second, this community doesn't abandon people who are trying to do the right thing. And third, we're tired of being afraid of some city thugs who think they can intimidate decent people. Another voice called out from the crowd, "We've set up a rotating schedule. There will be armed volunteers on this property 24 hours a day until this situation is resolved." Elena felt tears streaming down her face as she looked at the sea of people who had come to support her. People she had been afraid would reject her because of her father's actions and the trouble that had followed her to their community. "I don't know what to say," she managed. "You barely know me, and you're willing to put yourselves at risk." "Oh, Belena," said Martha Henderson, the elderly woman who ran the town's only diner. "We know enough. We know you work hard. We know you've been treated unfairly, and we know you've conducted yourself with dignity even when faced with unimaginable circumstances. That's enough for us." Sheriff Morrison stepped forward, his expression serious but hopeful. "This changes things significantly. With this level of community support and witness protection, we might be able to build a case against Marcelli's organization that goes far beyond just Elena's situation." Over the following weeks, Elena's courageous decision to fight back, rather than disappear, transformed into something much larger than anyone had anticipated. Her testimony, combined with evidence gathered by federal investigators, led to arrests that dismantled a human trafficking network operating across multiple states. The community's support provided the security and moral foundation that made her testimony possible, while also sending a clear message that Millerville would not tolerate criminal predators targeting vulnerable people. But perhaps most importantly, Elena's experience had sparked conversations throughout the county about how to protect young people from exploitation and how to recognize signs of human trafficking before situations became desperate. She began speaking at high schools and community meetings, sharing her story and helping other young women understand their rights and resources. As spring arrived at the ranch, Elena and Ben found themselves working together not just on cattle and crops, but on expanding their partnership to include advocacy and education work. Elena had enrolled in online college courses to study social work and criminal justice, while Ben had discovered that his quiet nature and practical problem-solving skills made him surprisingly effective at organizing community responses to social problems. "You know," Elena said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, "I never thanked you properly for what you did that day at the auction." "You've thanked me every day by making something meaningful out of the opportunity I was able to provide," Ben replied. "But Elena, I need to tell you something. Helping you wasn't just about doing the right thing. It was about discovering that I had been living half a life, avoiding connections and responsibilities that might have made me vulnerable to being hurt. And now I know that being vulnerable to being hurt is also being vulnerable to being happy, to finding purpose, to building something that matters beyond personal comfort and security." Elena smiled, recognizing in Ben's words the same realization she had come to about her own life. "Ben, I need to tell you something too. When I first came here, I thought I owed you everything, my freedom, my safety, my future. But I've learned that what we actually owe each other is partnership, respect, and the commitment to help each other become the best versions of ourselves." As the stars appeared in the vast Oklahoma sky, Ben and Eleanor reflected on how completely their lives had been transformed by that day at the auction barn. What had begun as an emergency intervention had evolved into a genuine partnership based on shared values, mutual respect, and a commitment to fighting for justice, not just for themselves, but for others who faced similar challenges. The community that had rallied to protect Elena had also discovered something important about itself, that when faced with a choice between looking away from injustice and taking a stand for what was right, they were capable of remarkable courage and compassion. Elena's father had tried to auction her off to pay his debts, but what had actually happened was that she had found a community willing to invest in her future and a partner committed to helping her build a life of purpose and meaning. The transaction that was supposed to destroy her dignity had instead become the foundation for a story of redemption that would inspire their community for generations to come. This remarkable story of Elena and Ben reminds us that moral courage often requires us to risk our own comfort and security to protect others, and that communities are strongest when they refuse to abandon vulnerable members. Their journey shows us that true partnership is built not on gratitude or obligation, but on mutual respect and shared commitment to creating something meaningful together. If this story moved you, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more inspiring stories about justice, compassion, and the power of community action. Let us know in the comments what city you're watching from and share your thoughts about standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. Remember, we all have the power to intervene when we witness injustice, and sometimes one person's courage can inspire an entire community to take action. Until next time, keep believing in the power of ordinary people to do extraordinary things when faced with moral challenges.